Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar brought to you by Mix It Up from Bayer Crop Science. My name is Michelle Allison, and I'm the publisher of Top Crop Manager. Today is the first of 3 installments of this year's Resistance Management webinar series, and I'm joined today by Chris Henson, Market Development Rep with Bayer Crop Science. Today, during our session, Chris will present on Kosha research conducted over the past few years and will share helpful actions you can integrate into your operation to manage this continuing pest. Thanks to Mix It Up by Bayer Crop Science for sponsoring our session today. From seed to harvest, Bayer is focused on delivering top performing solutions to address some of your toughest farm challenges. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available to all attendees and registrants approximately 24 hours after the live broadcast. This session is scheduled to run for approximately 45 minutes. Following Chris's presentation, we'll open the floor for questions. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, please type them into the questions tab found on the GoToWebinar panel on your computer screen. This webinar has been approved for 1 CCA CEU credit in Integrated Pest Management. Further instruction will follow the presentation if you did not include your CCA number on the registration form. Without further ado, I'll let Chris take it away.
Thanks so much, Michelle. So I'm just going to get right into it. All right, so Kosha, a familiar foe, something that is on farms across Western Canada, becoming a bigger growing issue, as we see the Kosha survey results come through. But before we really get started here, I believe we're going to run a poll, and these are the answers. So what is Kosha doing on your farm? So is it increasing, decreasing, staying the same? And I believe they're going to run that poll right now, and I'm just going to give it about 30 seconds to run through, and I'm just curious on the results.
All right, a couple more seconds and we're going to close it up. Right.
All right, so I'm just going to wait for the results to come through here.
All right, so it says 51% increasing, 5% decreasing, and 44% staying the same, Chris.
Right on. Yeah, so I think that the message here is that people are concerned about Kosha. Probably why we've got pretty good attendance today. So hopefully when we go through this presentation, I give you guys some tips and tricks. Some of the effective strategies that have worked on my farm personally, and yeah, maybe some cultural practices as well that are working. All right, so who am I and why should you listen to me? So my name's Christian Hansen, as the presenters have already pointed out. I usually go by Chris. I'm a professional agrologist and a CCA. I work for Bayer Crop Science as a market development representative. So a little bit of my background. So I was born and raised in Yorkton, Saskatchewan. So I have a very tight ties there. I started with Monsanto in 2014, and I've been working with Bayer since 2019. So, I moved over with the merger with Bayer and Monsanto. I've been living in Alberta since 2017, and that's kind of when my exposure to Kosha really kind of took off. I operate a research farm out of Carsland, Alberta, which is just outside of Calgary, about 25 minutes. I specialize in canola, corn, and crop protection products, including seed treatments, fungicides, and herbicides. So what is market development? So market development is the group that works with products very close to commercialization. So we are kind of the final stop before a product is fully launched into the marketplace, and we run agronomic trials to try and answer some of the questions that come from the marketplace regarding good agronomics, and we come up with the overall recommendations for those products. All right, so this might be a little close to some hearts. You probably have seen this in your field. This is Kosha. It has a very distinct look, alternating narrow leaves that branch off in multiple shoots. in terms of how it grows, so it's very elastic and it adapts to growing conditions quite readily. Depending on your growing conditions, kochia can be small and produce seeds very quickly. That's mostly in terms of drought stress. But if growing conditions are good, it can grow as high as 6 feet. And I often tell the story. So I was on my way home to Saskatchewan this summer actually, and we were going through the Starbucks drive-through, and the kochia in the gardens that were through the drive-through were actually up past the delivery windows. So, it can really turn into a monster plant. It will typically shoot up taller and shoot up and be taller in competitive conditions, but if it has the space, it will become more bushy. I kind of refer to mature kochia as a Christmas tree like appearance. Once it starts to reach maturity, it begins to dry down quite rapidly and becomes very brittle, dropping seeds very easily in the high winds. Eventually, the plant will break off from the main stem and turn into a tumbleweed. And this is the primary device that the plant actually uses to spread throughout a field. So I want to talk about weed size for optimal control a little bit here. So we've got these three photos here. On the left is generally what I would recommend. If you have kochia coming in like that, you want to get in there as soon as possible. The middle photo there is getting past the control window for a lot of the herbicides that we have on the marketplace today. So if I had one message for you guys today, it's to try and control the kochia small. You're going to have a lot more options, and they're going to work a lot more effectively. So this is what kochia looks like in a field. So it tends to form in patches and will steadily spread across the field if you don't control it. So this is a field of wheat, and it's fairly contained, but it can be much worse in less competitive crops that do not have, many effective herbicide groups. So I'm talking about, peas, lentils, and flax. Not a lot of in-crop herbicides that are effective at controlling kochia. So this problem can get a lot worse much more quickly. It Since kochia is so aggressive and it germinates so early, it really makes it difficult for crops to compete. The result is a patch with very little, if any, of the seeded crop. It simply chokes it out, and it really never has a chance to establish. And that's especially true because kochia loves saline patches and um, you know poor ground basically. So even if the crop does tend to germinate, it never really has a chance because it doesn't have the water and the nutrients to compete with kochia. So just some real quick kochia quick facts. So, we have resistance confirmed to 2, 4, and 9, but many populations are still susceptible. It emerges very quickly. It's one of the first weeds out of the ground, and it needs only 50 growing degree days to actually germinate. In comparison, if you think of wheat needs about 150. It's very hardy. It loves any kind of conditions and survives well in drought and saline soils. So I often make the joke a couple years ago in Alberta here, we were very dry, and even the kochia was suffering. So, that's how we knew we were in a drought. One plant produces up to 30,000 seeds, but the good news is that up to 90% lose viability within a year. And the overall viability of the seeds is 2 to 3 years, according to research. Resistance grows quite rapidly. So kochia in Alberta was only approximately 5% glyphosate resistant in 2012, but 2017 survey revealed over 50% of the kochia populations that were surveyed actually had resistance. And that could be for many reasons. It could be that growers are becoming more aware of glyphosate resistance and submitted more samples, but that's the way the data came back. Triple resistance has been confirmed in as much as 10% of the populations that were surveyed. And as I said before, spray it small. Once kochia is above that 5 to 6 centimeters in height, it becomes much more difficult to control. So this is a photo of some plots on my farm. And this just kind of gives you the importance of tank mixing. So on the left, we have actually this entire population was glyphosate resistant. But the plot on the left was sprayed with just Roundup Weathermax, and on the plot on the right, it was sprayed with 2 modes of action that we'll talk about later. But it just kind of gives you an idea of if we're just relying on glyphosate to control our kochia, it is not a good management strategy. So let's talk about that a little bit more. But before we get into that, I want to talk a little bit about the resistance survey. So I've taken these slides from Alberta and Agri-Food Canada. So first thing I want to talk about is there is differing levels of glyphosate resistance. So let's talk about how Kosha becomes resistant in the first place. So Kosha has developed resistance in a really interesting way. Instead of a mutation of the enzyme to completely block certain herbicides like glyphosate or group 4, Kosha simply produces more of the enzyme that the product is targeting. This is why in some populations we see a large, what we'll call a rate response to certain herbicides. Kochia may be resistant, but eventually enough of the certain herbicide may be enough to successfully kill the plant. Because of this type of resistant populations still often show symptomology of herbicide taking course, but will eventually grow through it. And we can kind of see that in even the right-hand photo there. So you see that there's quite a few plants that are stunted, quite a bit shorter than the larger ones. And that is the glyphosate going through the plant itself, but not entirely killing it. It's important to note that in some situations, a setback, knocking the plant back, can sometimes be enough, along with crop competition, to actually successfully control a population. So, you spray it, and then you have your crop coming up behind it. And once the canopy closes, that can be an effective control method, but it's not something that you want to rely on. And I want to be clear that using more of a single mode of action that your kochia is already resistant to is not an effective management strategy. So, just going in with more of, let's say, glyphosate is not an effective management strategy. You really need to be throwing in another mode of action in order to effectively control it. So just from the survey results, so Kosha survey of suspected resistant populations. So starting in 2012, only glyphosate resistance was really looked at. Notice how the populations that were tested with glyphosate resistance was relatively low. In 2017, screening for 249 was conducted, and even between those years, it has progressed quite rapidly. And as I mentioned before, the reason for this may also be that growers are becoming more aware of the issue and more samples were submitted. Um, in 2021, we should be seeing the results of samples submitted around 2019. And I know that because I submitted samples of my own glyphosate resistance or glyphosate resistant kochia on my farm. And spoiler alert, it is probably going to be higher again. So again, that was the Alberta study. It's sort of a similar story for Manitoba, but I won't go too much into that because I don't have enough time. But after studying 300 sites, this is just the distribution. Notice that we assume all of the populations have at least some sort of resistance to group 2 herbicides. This distribution does not report on the severity of resistance. If the kochia exhibited any level of resistance, it was counted. So note that there is a section for PPO products. So that's your group 14s. The new survey should report if there is any PPO resistant populations that are starting to pop up. All right, so let's talk a little bit about chemical control. All right, so these are the herbicide groups that have products that are registered for either control or suppression of kochia. It seems like we have quite a few options, but most of them have some sort of caveat. For example, what we just learned in the last section is that we consider all populations to have some sort of level to group 2, so these should not be relied on solely. So let's drop those out. Similar story for our group 4s. While these can be tag mixed with other products, they should not be relied upon solely. Lastly, we need to drop out glyphosate because, obviously we just talked about glyphosate resistance and we shouldn't be relying that on its own. So we are left with 3, 6, 10, 14, 15, and 27. And that still seems not too bad. But let's talk a little bit about Group 3. Group 3 is expensive, it's labor intensive, and requires good management to be effective, which may or may not be practical if we have huge acreages. So let's drop that one. Group 6 can be affected if the kochia is sprayed early enough, but anything over 5 centimeters is going to have a really difficult time being controlled. So I have some photos of that later on that we'll look at, but let's drop out Group 6. And then lastly, Group 10. So we have glufosinate, which is going to be sprayed in our Liberty Link canolas. It's another one where the kochia needs to be small enough in order to be controlled. So let's drop that one out too. So what are we left with? In a worst case scenario, we have 14, 15, and 27. which is, frankly not that much. And if we do have some PPO resistance popping up from that survey, we could lose, 14 as well. All right, so let's talk about controlling kochia in canola. So I don't have any good photos of a pre-emerge strategy, but my kind of fallback has been to use products like bromoxynil and carfentrazone, which is a new farm product with Conquer. Usually when you're spraying the kochia at this stage, it's small enough to be killed off effectively. And it's come to my knowledge that there are some Group 27 products that are being registered for pre-emergent canola, and those are probably going to be excellent control. I'm excited to try them. I haven't gotten my hands on them yet, but I am excited to use them. But for an in-crop strategy, we're already looking ahead for options that can help offer the superior weed control, but also control, glyphosate-resistant kochia. So these photos represent the 3 different trait systems that are currently available in the canola market. I didn't have Clearfield in here, so I guess there is 4. But in the left photo, there is a patch of kochia that was not controlled with our 2 applications of glyphosate. So, it looks pretty clean, but if you look on the far left there, there's actually a patch of kochia coming back right there. Unfortunately, this population that I sprayed, I guess, wasn't very evenly distributed. But there is some in there, and it wasn't controlled by the glyphosate, and that patch will propagate and probably cause an issue later on if this was in a commercial field. In the middle, the 2 applications of Liberty encouraged a quicker weed regrowth. So, it did control the kochia that was in there. But, what we tend to see with Liberty is a really fast burn off and then a really quick regrowth. So that's just what happened there. And then the last photo combines both trait systems. So, we now have on the market TrueFlex canola with Liberty Link technology. Really combining those 2 trait systems is really the premium, I will say, product that we want to use to control kochia. We get the really awesome weed control of glyphosate, but we also control our glyphosate-resistant kochia by mixing the 2 systems. All right, let's talk a little bit about wheat. So before I go any further, it's important to note that the best time to control kochia is pre-emerge, and that's for a few reasons. Generally in the pre-emerge stage, we're talking about kochia that's very small. We have a lot more herbicide groups that we can play with than we can in crop, and if you control that kochia early, there's a good chance that your crop competition is going to do a lot of the work for you later on by controlling the kochia that way. In these photos, it's clear that combining the multiple modes of action as well as products that have enhanced residual control are really going to give you the best results. So from an in-crop perspective, the best option is to mix an effective Group 27 along with your typical Group 2 products for any leftovers. So in the middle photo, that's just mixing 2 modes of action, and we're getting, I would say, effective control for sure. But there is a few pop-ups in there that might become a concern later on. Now on the right-hand side there, we're combining 4 different groups, all of which may or may not be effective against kochia. So, we've got a group 4 and a group 9 in there. There could be resistance to those 2 for sure. But, adding fierce in there, the 14 and the 15, really sharpens up control. And then we are getting some residual control with the Roundup Extend. So for those that are unfamiliar, Roundup Extend is Dicamba, and it's a really awesome product I've been working with for years. We'll go into it a little bit more later on here. So peas, what can we do before them? So, even less in-crop products that we can use in peas. So we really want to make sure that we're getting an effective burn off before we go into peas. So same thing, we can go in with heat. It really provides effective control, but it really doesn't have the residual. I found in my work that Authority is a great product. It has a little bit of extra residual control that's really going to allow your peas to start growing, get ahead of the kochia, and hopefully choke them off. So just a couple different options in there. And for those of you that have grown corn before, so this is where I was talking about. So in the left photo there, we've got partner, which is our group 6. When I got around to spraying this, the kochia was already fairly large. So you'll see in there, we had some knockback for sure, but the kochia is starting to really grow through it, and that would not be effective control in the left photo there. Now, if we combine both a pre and a post application in corn, you're going to get results like that on the right there. So you can see I have untreated strips on the left and right hand sides just to show you how bad the pressure actually was. But Roundup Extend, so again, that's dicamba and glyphosate as a pre at a little bit higher rate. It really sharpens up the control and gives you some residual. And then coming in post with a Roundup and Group 27. So there's multiple products that are registered for corn. One of those products is going to be launched by Bayer here shortly, but it actually doesn't have Kosha on the label yet. So we are working to get that on the label. It's really giving you awesome control. Group 27s are one of my favorites for controlling Kosha right now, and I really hope that they're going to be an option and one of those tools in our toolkit in the future. All right, so I wanted to touch on dicamba a little bit, and you might be wondering, Chris, why do you want to talk about dicamba? It's a group 4. We've talked about, kochia having, group 4 resistance. The reason I want to bring it up is because in the future, whether or not you're aware, DT canola, so dicamba tolerant canola, is going to be coming in the future. We already have Roundup Ready to Extend soybeans. But dicamba tolerant canola is going to really offer us another option and give us the rates that we need to control kochia effectively. So I really wanted to touch on it a little bit here. So dicamba is very effective at controlling kochia at higher rates, and I want to emphasize higher rates because at the lower applications of kochia, or sorry, at the lower applications of dicamba, we probably don't get the best control. So it's important to understand that the rates in this specific trial are registered on Roundup Ready to Extend soybeans, which most folks on this call likely have very little experience with. However, it is important to understand this interaction because dicamba tolerant canola, like I said, is in the pipeline, and we will have this one. We'll have access to these rates one day. So, really want to call out, Roundup Extend at the 1800 gram rate and the 1350 gram rate. So, there's a huge rate response there as we get to the higher rates. And this is just a photo of that kind of an action. So this is on the left side is the high rate of dicamba, and the 150 gram per hectare rate is something that we would typically see, pre-emerge to say wheat today. So, huge rate response there. We're getting a lot of regrowth in that 150 gram per hectare rate 28 days later, whereas the 600 gram per hectare rate is really hanging on. And I know for a fact that this population is group 4 and 9 resistant. So, really excited that one day we'll have this in our tool chest. And again, so on the left is a glyphosate resistant plot, sprayed only with Roundup. So, the Roundup definitely knocked it back a little bit. And on the right is just the low rate of dicamba. So that's still twice the rate that we have, available to us today to spray before wheat. But even at the low rate, we see a massive increase in control. However, you'll note that there is a few escapes in there. So it will be really important to manage expectations and to use rates that we know can control the problem with no escapes. So that's what we really want to stop, is those escapes from happening. And one last thing is I really want to touch on, I get questions on 2,4-D efficacy versus dicamba. So the simple answer is that I would not rely on 2,4-D at all. And, from this photo that really emphasizes that. It will definitely knock the kochia back, but it doesn't effectively control it. And you can really see that in the regrowth there. And the other thing with 2,4-D is it really doesn't have any residual control, especially with kochia. So, it's kind of buyer beware on that, I guess, if somebody is trying to sell you that as an effective mode of action against kochia. So beyond, herbicides, what else can we do? So cultural control. So this is another study that came from Charles Geddes from AAFC, just looking at rotation and how it can affect, kochia control. But also with rotation, looking at row spacing as well. So row spacing definitely enhances crop competition and can help reduce the amount of propagation from the kochia. Like I mentioned before, kochia is very competitive. However, it will still suffer if it is overcrowded. So the top photos are all seeded on 18-inch spacing, while the bottoms are on 9. So special consideration needs to be taken in a very non-competitive crops. So like especially the lentils. So you can see on the 18-inch rows, the kochia is basically taken over. Um, we'll look at some graphs here shortly, but definitely you're going to see in your shorter crops that kochia takes over. If we allow these patches to really propagate, we're going to have a huge issue the following year. So again, we're really building up that seed bank if we allow this to happen, and we don't want that to happen. So this is just some of the results from that same trial. So notice that the crop competition from the narrower rows is significantly better at preventing weed propagation. Likewise, in the second graph, we see that bumping up our seeding rate helps to reduce the overall populations. Maybe not as much as we would like, but it is significant. The last graph shows that in a rotation, there's a trend towards reducing the overall population with rotation, but it wasn't statistically significant. The good news is that it wasn't increasing either, though. So, you'd expect with those bigger patches of kochia, if you let them go to seed, that you're going to have a bigger issue the following year. And as expected, we see the effective herbicide groups doing more work to control the initial population. Some of the other cultural things you can do. So because kochia's viability is really short in the seed bank, it's important to control the developing patches before they expand. So one good Alberta wind, I've experience with this, will really blow the kochia across the field and turn it into a much larger scale issue. So some experimentation has been done with mowing, before the kochia goes to seed set. So if you do have kochia patches in your field and you have the ability to go out and actually physically mow them before they go to seed, you know, most of the time your crop is pretty much, non-existent anyway in those patches or is going to yield very little. The last thing you want to do is put that through the combine. So you want to get in there and control it some way. So you can go in there and you can mow. You can go in there with an effective mode of action and do spot spraying on those spots alone. If you go in with a UTV or something like that, that can be really effective. You just want to kill those plants and get them out of there before they can propagate. Um, growers have successfully grazed and also hayed kochia patches. Now, the one thing about this is you really need to be careful because kochia seeds can be toxic to livestock. So definitely don't want to be feeding anything that has seeds or flowers. And a fun fact is that kochia is not actually native to Canada and was likely brought here as an ornamental or as a forage option. And some people, I've never met anybody, but apparently some people still call it poor man's alfalfa. Um, and the last thing you could probably do is cut it down and sell it on eBay. If you go on eBay, I'll show you some photos here. So there is listings for kochia ornamental plants online that you can buy, and apparently it's very popular in Asian countries. So to summarize, these are my main takeaway points from this lecture today. So spray early. That is the number one. As I mentioned before, get in there early, control it while it's small. Use multiple effective modes of action wherever possible. So we talked about that. Use your pre-plant window as effectively as possible. So this means applying those multiple modes of action where you can. Rotate your crops to allow for some more diversity in your field, and do not cut rates. So this likely is one of the causes of the issues that we're having now. So that goes for both your herbicide and your seeding. So as we saw before, with the cultural methods, cutting your seeding rate is probably not a good idea just because you are going to reduce the amount of competition that the kochia is facing. So, definitely don't cut rates anywhere. If you can, narrower rows and higher seeding rates, can definitely help to reduce the amount of propagation. So, especially with our more non-competitive crops like lentils or peas, you definitely don't want to be cutting those rates, and you want to try and narrow them up if you can. And if possible, try to get in there and control the patches. So if you go in and do your pre-emerge and you do your post-emerge and you still have kochia patches in your field, might be worth considering getting out there and controlling them by a mechanical means, whether it's by mowing or spot spraying. And I believe that's it. So I think we're going to get into the question period now.
All right, thank you very much, Chris, for the presentation today. One last special thanks to Bayer Crop Science for their sponsorship of today's webinar. We'll jump into a few questions that we have. So with the group 27s coming, are you worried about the overuse of them?
Yeah, so I did talk a little bit before canola that a group 27 is being registered as a pre-emerge before canola. I'm not going to say no to any new herbicides that are coming out for pre-emergent canola, because quite honestly the options are quite limited right now. Now from a resistance management standpoint, that's just throwing another crop in there that that we're going to be using group 27s in. So if you think about we're using them in our cereals, if we start using them in canola, we're going to have an issue. And then especially with corn growers, they rely on group 27s quite a bit as well. So in a typical, say, Southern Albertan rotation where you have a corn grower, if you have a 4-year rotation, you're using group 27s 3 out of the 4 years now. What exactly is that going to mean for resistance management? It's kind of anybody's guess, but yeah, I would suspect that in the future we could be seeing group 27 resistant kochia as well, which would not be a good thing.
Okay, a couple other came in here. So clearly kochia loves to live in those saline, salty areas.
Yeah.
Any, best management tips or methods to manage it in that area if the grower, does want to try and clear it up and put some crop into those spots?
Yeah, so nothing really specific just for saline patches. Where we see kochia is already in the saline areas. So all the methods that we've already talked about today, are going to be effective at controlling those same saline patches. Um, you know, I think that in those patches you might see a little bit more of that of those cultural control methods like the mowing and stuff like that. That would probably be your best bet. And then spot spraying if you have to.
Okay, great, thanks. A registrant did ask, are we seeing resistant kochia in Southern Ontario, or can we expect to see it in the future?
So whoever asked that question, is the other 4 glyphosate resistant weeds not enough? Probably the water hemp and the Canada fleabane and everything has probably choked it all already. But I've done research into that a little bit, and from what I understand, there isn't any confirmed kochia populations in Southern Ontario. But that's not to say that they're not there. In all likelihood, it probably exists. It probably just isn't on a large enough scale for growers to notice yet.
Okay, great, thanks. Any insight to the effect of repeating the active ingredients in the pre-burn application and then in an in-crop application?
Yeah, so they're probably referring to, let's say like Roundup Ready canola and stuff like that. It's something that's going to happen. It's something that has to happen. You've got other weeds in your field. So you've only got a limited amount of mode of actions that you can actually go in and use. From a resistance standpoint, I would say, don't skimp on your rates. You definitely want to go in with the registered highest rate that you possibly can, especially if you are going in to control kochia. As we talked about a little bit before, there definitely is a rate response, and you'll see that even with glyphosate resistant kochia. It might not be effectively controlled with, say, like the 0.33 rate in our traditional Roundup Ready systems, but with our new TrueFlex rates, we definitely knock it back a little bit farther, even so much so as to actually kill it. So yeah, that would be my main takeaway is if you are going in with a pre-burn and then a post-emerge with the same mode of actions, try to use the rates, the right rate, I guess I'll say.
Okay, perfect, thanks. I've got a couple more questions on lentils here, and then we'll wrap it up.
Sure.
If you can touch on any options available for control in red lentils, and
Yeah.
if you have insights into a plant count per meter squared for
Okay.
seeding rates.
Um, so in terms of lentils, so if you know you have a kochia problem, you definitely want to be growing, clearfield lentils, just because you have, imazamox and some of those other, more effective group twos. I know that we talked about, group two resistance and how that's an issue, but some of those clearfield products still work on kochia, as long as it's small enough. So again, your pre-emerge is going to be your window where you want to get in there with, probably, with heat and in Roundup, just to really get a good pre-burn, and then spraying in crop with the Viper product would probably be your best option. In terms of seeding rate, to be honest with you, I can't really comment on that. I have very little experience with lentils myself, but I could definitely get back to whoever asked that question. So,
Perfect, great, thank you very much. So with that, we'll start to wrap things up for today. If you do have any further questions following the presentation, please reach out to us and we'll share them with Chris. Before we end, a reminder that this webinar has been approved for 1 CCA CEU credit. And if you did not submit your CCA number when registering, please email your first and last name and CCA number to webinars@annexbusinessmedia.com. And these instructions will also be found in our follow-up email, which will hold the recording of the webinar. Thanks again, Chris, and thank you to everybody for tuning in to today's webinar. Don't forget to visit topcropmanager.com/webinars to view all of our previous and upcoming webinars. The next installment in this series will happen on April 13th with Peter Sikkema, and I hope you can join us then as well. Thanks again. Take care, everybody. Have a great day.
thanks, everyone.